You can't grow food here. This isn't some country bumpkin neighborhood. I looked up from my tomato plants to see a woman in designer sunglasses standing at the edge of my property, her arms crossed and face pinched with anger. I leaned back in my chair, letting the cool evening breeze roll in off the lake, the scent of pine and water blending into something I'd dreamed about for years. After 30 years as a firefighter, running toward disasters while everyone else ran away, I finally had my piece of peace, a quiet lakeside cabin, a sturdy dock, and a boat just waiting for long, lazy fishing trips. Whispering Pines had seemed like the perfect place to settle down, just far enough from town to be quiet, but close enough that I wouldn't feel completely isolated. I thought I'd earned this, paid for it with sweat, burns, and more sleepless nights than I cared to count. Then, right on cue, trouble showed up in a pressed blazer and designer heels. "Excuse me, are you Oscar Reyes?" I looked up from my fishing reel to see a tall woman standing at the edge of my dock, clipboard in hand, her expression the same one I'd seen on plenty of overzealous inspectors back in the firehouse, one that said, "You're about to have a problem." "I am," I said slowly, already bracing myself. "Well," she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We need to talk about your dock." I stood there, gripping my fishing reel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My dock. I'd built that thing with my own 2 hands, spending weeks making sure it was sturdy, safe, and blended naturally into the landscape. Now, here was some clipboard-wielding bureaucrat telling me there was a problem. "Your dock is in violation of the Whispering Pines Lakeside Community Guidelines," she said, flipping through her neatly printed papers as if she were handing me a parking ticket instead of stomping all over my retirement dreams. "It extends 2 feet past the allowable length for private structures." I let out a slow breath, forcing my temper down. "You're joking, right? There are a dozen docks on this lake longer than mine." I pointed across the water where several neighbors had platforms stretching well beyond mine, some with covered seating areas and even built-in boat lifts. "I followed every regulation when I built this thing." She barely glanced up. "I can't speak to other properties at this time, but as of now, you have 7 days to either modify or remove the structure. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of," she scanned her paper, $2.50 per day until the violation is corrected. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "So let me get this straight," I said, stepping forward, my voice tight with frustration. "I spent months making sure I followed the rules, my dock is safe, and nobody complained, but now, all of a sudden, it's a problem." She pursed her lips, adjusting her clipboard. "Rules are rules, Mr. Reyes." My blood boiled. This wasn't about a dock. This was about control. About some overreaching HOA deciding they had the power to dictate how I enjoyed my own land. I forced myself to take another deep breath, my fists clenching. "We'll see about that." Her smirk told me she thought she'd won. What she didn't know was that I'd spent my whole career fighting against impossible odds. And I sure as hell wasn't about to roll over now. I woke up the next morning thinking maybe, just maybe, this was all some kind of mistake. Maybe I'd call the HOA office, and they'd tell me the clipboard lady was confused, that my dock was perfectly fine, and I could go back to enjoying my mornings on the water in peace. Then I stepped outside. There, nailed to my dock like a badge of dishonor, was a bright yellow notice. Official violation. Structure must be removed immediately. Fine accruing, $250 per day. My stomach twisted. I yanked the paper off, my hands shaking with anger. The ink was barely dry on their first warning, and they were already slapping fines on me. I turned toward my neighbor's property across the lake, where his oversized dock sat undisturbed, his motorboat bobbing gently in the water. No yellow notices. No fines. Just the quiet lapping of the lake against the shore. That was when I knew. This wasn't about regulations. This was about me. I stalked back inside and dug out my property records. I'd kept everything, permits, zoning approvals, the HOA's own handbook. I flipped through the pages, heart pounding, until I found what I was looking for. There it was, in black and white, private docks were allowed up to 20 feet from the shore. Mine. 19 feet, 8 inches. They had no case. And yet, they were still coming after me. That was the part that set my teeth on edge. The part that made my blood simmer. It wasn't just the unfairness of it, it was the targeting. Someone wanted me gone, or at least wanted me to bow down, to show I was willing to comply without a fight. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think clearly. If this was a game, I needed to figure out the rules before I could beat them. But one thing was certain, I wasn't about to let them win. I picked up my phone and dialed. Not the HOA. A lawyer. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that bright yellow violation notice nailed to my dock, taunting me like a scarlet letter. My instincts screamed that this wasn't just about a regulation, someone had made this personal. But who? And why? At 2 a.m., I found myself pacing the length of my living room, scrolling through the HOA's website. Their meeting minutes were posted publicly, but buried in pages of bureaucratic nonsense. I kept skimming, my frustration mounting, until something caught my eye, a brief mention from 2 months ago, proposed shoreline modifications to enhance community value, pending approval from board. Modifications? My grip tightened on my phone. What modifications? I dug deeper, cross-referencing property records. And then, there it was, an application from a real estate group to acquire lakeside properties for a beautification initiative. The document was vague, but one thing stood out, my property was right in the middle of it. A chill ran down my spine. They didn't want my dock gone, they wanted me gone. I closed my laptop, my mind racing. If they were trying to push me out, they had a plan. And if they had a plan, I needed to be 5 steps ahead. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding as I crept toward the dock. The lake was calm, moonlight rippling across the water. I moved cautiously, scanning for anything out of place. And then, I froze. Fresh footprints in the damp soil. Someone had been here. Recently. I swallowed hard, adrenaline flooding my system. Had they planted more violations? Damaged something? A sudden rustling in the bushes made my pulse skyrocket. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Nothing. No movement. But the uneasy feeling in my gut told me I wasn't alone. I backed toward my house, every nerve in my body on edge. If they thought they could scare me off, they were wrong. Tomorrow, I was going to find out exactly who was behind this. And when I did, I'd make sure they regretted ever coming after me. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. No more waiting, no more second-guessing, I needed proof. If the HOA was working with developers to push me out, I had to expose them. I started with the property records office. The clerk, an older man with glasses perched at the edge of his nose, raised an eyebrow when I asked about recent sales in my neighborhood. "Lot of movement around the lake lately," he muttered, flipping through files. "Mostly to a company called Ridgeview Investments." That name made my stomach twist. Ridgeview was the same development firm listed in the HOA's meeting minutes. I leaned in. "Can you pull up any pending offers?" He hesitated. "That's not usually public information." I slid a 20 across the counter. He glanced around, then sighed, typing something into his computer. "Looks like Ridgeview's got interest in 3 more properties." One of them, his eyes flicked up. "Yours." A slow burn of anger spread through my chest. I clenched my jaw, forcing a steady breath. They were trying to buy me out before I even knew I was for sale. I thanked the clerk and walked out, my head spinning. If they were doing this to me, how many others were being targeted? I needed to talk to my neighbors. That afternoon, I made my rounds. Some doors slammed in my face. Years of HOA conditioning had made people wary of questioning authority. But others hesitated, then let me in. Mrs. Holloway, who'd lived here since before the HOA even existed, gripped my arm with trembling fingers. "They fined me for my mailbox color," she whispered. "Then for my rose bushes. Said they weren't uniform enough." Her voice broke. "I put my house up for sale last week. I don't have a choice." Across the street, Mr. Patel told a similar story. "I paid thousands in fines. Then Ridgeview knocked on my door with an offer. Almost like they knew I was desperate." A pattern was emerging. This wasn't about violations. It was a coordinated effort to drive us out. And now, I had the proof. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, spreading out everything I had gathered: property records, letters, violation notices, and now, sworn statements from neighbors who were too afraid to speak up. The pieces fit together too well for this to be anything but a deliberate scheme. The HOA and Ridgeview Investments were working together to drive people out, issue bogus fines, and force sales at rock-bottom prices. But now, I wasn't just a victim, I had evidence. And I wasn't going to fight this alone. The next morning, I called an emergency neighborhood meeting at my house. I didn't know how many people would show up, but as cars started pulling into my driveway, I realized something: people were ready to fight back. I stood up, holding a stack of documents. "This isn't about landscaping or mailbox colors," I said, scanning the crowd. "This is about power. It's about money. The HOA and Ridgeview are working together to force us out, to buy up our homes for pennies on the dollar and turn this neighborhood into a high-profit development. And I have the proof." A murmur spread through the group. Some people looked shocked, others nodded as if they had suspected it all along. Mrs. Holloway wiped her eyes. "I knew something wasn't right," she whispered. "We're not helpless," I continued. "I've spoken to an attorney. We can fight this. We can demand a full audit of the HOA's finances, challenge these fake violations, and take this to the county board. But we have to stand together." The room fell silent for a moment, then, one by one, hands started going up. "I'm in," said Mr. Patel, his voice steady. "So am I," added a younger couple from down the street. Soon, nearly everyone was standing, nodding, talking among themselves. The fear that had kept them in check for so long was breaking. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't before: hope. The HOA had ruled with fear, but they had made one critical mistake: they had underestimated us. The next morning, the air in the neighborhood felt different. A quiet determination had settled over the people who had once been too afraid to challenge the HOA. Word had spread about our meeting, and now, the very people who had once whispered behind closed doors were speaking out in broad daylight. The neighborhood wasn't just waking up, it was mobilizing. I watched from my porch as Mrs. Holloway and Mr. Patel went door to door, talking to neighbors who hadn't attended the meeting, handing them copies of the documents I had gathered. Across the street, the Rodriguez family was filming a video testimonial about the harassment they had endured, ready to post it online for the world to see. But the HOA wasn't going down without a fight. By mid-morning, Eleanor Whitmore, the HOA president, had caught wind of our rebellion. Her black SUV screeched to a halt in front of my house, and within seconds, she was stomping up my driveway, her designer heels clicking against the pavement. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but this ends now," she hissed, thrusting a thick envelope into my chest. "You've been served." I glanced down at the envelope. "A lawsuit." "Of course." She smirked. "You think you can rally these people against us? The HOA has legal precedent, contracts, and money. You have nothing." I let out a slow breath, staring at her for a moment before smiling. "That's where you're wrong, Eleanor." Her smirk faltered. I stepped closer. I have them. I pointed down the street, where neighbors were gathered, watching the scene unfold. Where people were talking, sharing stories, gathering their own evidence. And the thing about people like you? You only have power when everyone's afraid. That's over now. For the first time, I saw something in Eleanor's eyes that I hadn't seen before. Not confidence. Not arrogance. Fear. Because she finally realized what I had known since last night. The HOA was no longer the most powerful force in this neighborhood. We were. The day Eleanor Whitmore fell from her pedestal, the entire neighborhood bore witness. It wasn't just justice, it was poetic justice. I stood at the back of the packed community center, arms crossed, watching as Eleanor's carefully constructed empire crumbled before her very eyes. The emergency HOA meeting, which she had called to restore order, had quickly spiraled into something she never anticipated, a public reckoning. Her voice wavered as she tried to maintain control. These accusations are baseless. The HOA has always acted in the community's best interest. Mrs. Holloway stood up, holding up a folder. Then why did you fine me $500 for having a sunflower bed in my yard, but conveniently ignore your own violations? Murmurs spread through the room. Another neighbor, Mr. Patel, held up photographic evidence, Eleanor's backyard, complete with an unapproved deck, a fence 2 inches too high, and string lights that violated the very same neighborhood aesthetics she had weaponized against the rest of us. Explain this, he said, his voice firm. Eleanor opened her mouth, then shut it. But the real blow came when Sarah, my lawyer, stepped forward with her own stack of papers. The financial audit we requested has uncovered something interesting, she said. Over $200,000 in misallocated HOA funds, rerouted to a private account under Eleanor's name. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eleanor went pale. The HOA board members, her own allies, began shifting in their seats, their expressions turning from concern to outright disgust. Eleanor stammered, "That's ridiculous. I only authorized." Enough. Mr. Ramirez, a board member who had once staunchly supported her, stood up. I make a motion to remove Eleanor Whitmore from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. The vote was unanimous. Eleanor's carefully curated image shattered in an instant. As security escorted her out of the meeting, her eyes locked with mine. I saw fury, shame, and worst of all, defeat. The very rules she had used to control others had finally turned against her. And it was the sweetest victory I had ever tasted. The dust from Eleanor's downfall had barely settled and the next battle began, one that would determine if justice truly prevailed or if the corruption she fostered would live on. With Eleanor gone, the HOA board scrambled to cover their tracks. They hoped her removal would be enough to pacify the angry homeowners, but they underestimated just how deep the resentment ran. The very next morning, I received an anonymous envelope in my mailbox. Inside were copies of financial records, the same ones Sarah had exposed at the meeting, but with even more damning details. Not only had Eleanor funneled money into her personal account, but she had approved contracts with fake companies linked directly to HOA board members. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. I immediately took the documents to Sarah. She skimmed through them, her eyes narrowing. "This isn't just HOA mismanagement," she said. "This is fraud, potentially on a criminal level." We wasted no time. By noon, a formal complaint was filed with the district attorney's office, and news stations were already knocking on my door. The neighborhood was buzzing. Some board members resigned on the spot, while others doubled down, claiming they had no knowledge of Eleanor's dealings. But it was too late for excuses. That evening, a special homeowners meeting was called, but this time, it wasn't the HOA board in charge. It was us, the very people they had spent years controlling, bullying, and exploiting. A vote was cast, and for the first time in years, the homeowners had the power. The remaining board members were dismantled, their authority stripped away as residents cheered. This isn't just about removing bad leadership, I told the crowd. This is about making sure it never happens again. As I looked around the room, I realized the shift wasn't just in leadership, it was in mindset. No one would fear the HOA again. Not after today. The fight wasn't over yet, but the tides had turned, and this time, we were in control. The courtroom was packed, tension thick in the air as the judge prepared to deliver the final ruling. I sat next to Sarah, my fingers clenched into fists, waiting for the verdict that would decide not only my future but the future of the entire neighborhood. Across from me, the remaining HOA board members, the ones who hadn't already fled or turned state's witness, sat rigid, their faces pale. Judge Thompson cleared her throat and looked directly at them. "The evidence is overwhelming," she said, her voice firm. "This board engaged in fraudulent financial practices, unauthorized property actions, and targeted harassment of residents under the guise of community standards." The room erupted in murmurs. I stole a glance at Eleanor, no longer the untouchable tyrant but a defeated woman staring down at her lap. The final blow came when the judge ordered the full dissolution of the HOA, the return of all illegal fines, and a multimillion-dollar settlement in favor of the residents. For a moment, there was silence. And then, it hit. A roar of applause, people cheering, clapping, some even crying. Years of frustration, of living in fear, of bending to the iron grip of a corrupt system, all of it shattered in an instant. I took a deep breath, letting it sink in. We won. Not just for me, not just for my farm, but for everyone who had suffered under the HOA's abuse. As the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed me, but I wasn't thinking about the headlines. I was thinking about my farm, my home, the land that had nearly been stolen from me. When I finally stepped outside, I was met with neighbors cheering, waiting with banners that read, "Justice for Oscar," and "No more HOA tyranny." Sarah turned to me, smirking. "Not bad for a small-town farmer, huh?" I exhaled, a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying finally lifting. Not bad at all. This wasn't just a win, it was vindication. And it was ours. The days following the courtroom victory felt surreal. For the first time in years, there was no fear, no ridiculous fines, no letters taped to my door with empty threats. The HOA office, once a fortress of intimidation, now sat vacant, its locks changed by order of the county. The entire community felt different, lighter, freer. It was like a weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. I stepped outside that morning, coffee in hand, to find neighbors gathered at the edge of my farm. There were no more glares, no more whispers behind my back. Instead, I saw smiles, nods of respect, some even bringing baked goods as peace offerings. "Guess we all should have listened to you sooner," Mr. Ramirez, one of the former board members, admitted, shuffling awkwardly. "You weren't the problem," I replied, giving him a firm handshake. Eleanor and her goons were. News spread fast, the HOA was officially disbanded, its remaining funds returned to residents, and any illegal liens placed on properties were erased. People celebrated on their lawns, some even hosting impromptu barbecues, toasting to a future without HOA tyranny. And Eleanor? She had skipped town overnight, avoiding the humiliation of facing the very people she tormented. Thomas, her right-hand man, wasn't as lucky. He was arrested for property destruction and fraud, and I had no doubt he'd spend the next few years learning about life from behind bars. That evening, the community gathered at the park, the same park they once claimed I was lowering the value of with my farm. This time, it was different. "Since you're the reason we got rid of them," Mrs. Rodriguez announced, raising her glass, "I think it's only right that you get the honor." She handed me a wooden plaque, freshly engraved. "In recognition of Oscar's fight for justice, we dedicate this space to community, unity, and standing up for what's right." I blinked, caught off guard by the emotion swelling in my chest. I hadn't just saved my farm, I had saved a community. And now, we were free. The sun was setting over the neighborhood as I stood at the edge of my farm, watching people pour in from all directions. Neighbors who once sided with Eleanor, who once sent angry letters or turned their backs on me at the grocery store, were now approaching with cautious smiles and outstretched hands. Some carried baskets of food, others tools and supplies, but all of them carried something more important, a willingness to rebuild what had been broken. The HOA was officially gone, and in its place, something entirely unexpected had grown, a real sense of community. No more threats, no more fines, no more ridiculous rules about which flowers were allowed in front yards or how tall a mailbox could be. The iron grip of HOA control had been replaced with something far stronger, the power of people choosing to work together, not against each other. I stepped forward and cleared my throat, quieting the crowd that had gathered. I'll be honest, I never expected this day to come. There were nights I thought about giving up, about selling my land just to get away from the fight. But standing here now, I know it was worth it. Applause broke out, and I saw faces in the crowd beaming with pride. Mr. Ramirez, the new neighborhood leader, grinned as he held up a petition, now filled with signatures. "We've all decided on something," he announced. "Instead of an HOA, we're forming a neighborhood co-op. No more rules dictated by a handful of power-hungry people. We make decisions together now. And the first order of business? Helping Oscar expand his farm, because it turns out, a lot of us actually love fresh food." I laughed as the crowd cheered, the sound echoing across the fields. Who would have thought that my farm, the very thing Eleanor tried to destroy, would end up being the heart of the neighborhood? That night, we got to work. Families helped replant the crops that had been trampled. Kids eagerly dug their hands into the dirt, learning how to grow food for the first time. Teenagers who had once spray-painted my mailbox were now hauling lumber for new fencing. At the edge of the property, Mrs. Rodriguez set up a table with homemade lemonade and cookies, offering them to every person who helped. "This is what real community looks like," she said with a smile, handing me a glass. I took a sip, looking out over the land I had fought so hard to protect. I didn't just win a legal battle, I had won something far greater. A neighborhood that finally understood what it meant to stand together.